Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Welcome to our brief webinar this morning or this afternoon, wherever you're at. We are going to be just spending about a half an hour today on specifically the Dyslexia Index Scores for KTEA-3 and WIAT-III. I do want to send out a quick apology to all the SLPs in the room. We have a huge room today on some of the grammar mistakes that I made in my title. I specifically made those mistakes for a reason. We call it the what's, the whys, and the hows, such as the what is, the why is, and the how is. But I really think about this as the what is this, why we do it, or why do we do it, and how do you do it, or how did we do it. So that's really how I want to frame this discussion today. We are going to go through each of them. I'm going to give you a quick overview just so you have a good sense of what they are. There is additional information on our website if you're interested in more information, such as frequently asked questions and so forth. Dr. Entwistle is also on the line here. He's going to manage that chat box, as Sherry mentioned. And I have a bunch of Q&As at the end. If I have time, I will get to most of them. But I know that the handout just went out, so the email just went out. So there's a handout available if you want to review those at your leisure. So for the half an hour today, again, I just broke it down into three basic sections, the what's, the whys, or why'd, or the how's. The first thing I want to talk about are the what's. What exactly are the Dyslexia Index Scores? And to start out this discussion, I want us to frame ourselves and frame our thinking in the idea of how we process assessment in the school systems or even in clinical settings. But in the school systems, it makes a lot of sense for us to couch it as a screening, assessing, intervening, and monitoring or intervention framework. And when we think about something like a Dyslexia Index Score, where does that fit in for you and where does that fit in for your system? Because depending on how you run the assessment process for reading, for universal screening, for special education diagnostic assessment, you can actually fit this process in a number of different areas. And what I really think is helpful is to think about it as a roadmap. And specifically with dyslexia, we have determined a specific roadmap that's very consistent across most settings, most schools. And when we think about it, let me pull up my little arrow here. There's a universal screening that occurs, and that's where we're testing all, if not all, of our students in the classroom or in the school system. There's a targeted screening approach, and there's a special education assessment approach, and we're really going to focus on those three areas in our discussion today. Will it fit in any one of those three categories? Well, as we go along, I think that this discussion is very important for us to have. The Dyslexia Index Scores don't necessarily fit very well into a universal screening system, into that part of the roadmap. The Dyslexia Index Scores are tests that will be given to a student, and I'll show a little bit more about the times that you'll take and what exactly we're looking at a little bit later on. But they really fit mostly into the targeted screening and the special education assessment sessions or sections of this roadmap. So I want you to think about it that way as we move forward. And how does this fit into your system? And feel free to put that in the chat box. How do you see this really fitting into it? How do you see this working into your system? The first thing I'll start out with is the WIAT-III. So what I'm going to take from this is the Dyslexia Index Scores Manual for the WIAT-III, authored by our research director, Christina Breaux. So the WIAT-III Dyslexia Index Scores, there are two of them, and they are broken up by grade. So grades K and 1, there are two subtests that we are administering. It's the Early Reading Skills Test and the Spelling Subtest. For grades 2 through 12 plus, the Dyslexia Index Score would be pseudo-word decoding, oral reading fluency, and spelling. When we think about it a little bit more in detail in terms of the strength or the psychometric support, we should always analyze what we're using in terms of the psychometric and theoretical support. But if we think about the psychometric support first, when we're looking at this slide here, we're seeing support for how well this specific Dyslexia Index Score differentiates between kids that are at risk and not at risk. So if I'm looking here at the first one for the K and 1 grades, we see the two subtests here in the next column. The mean reliability for this index score is 0.94. It's very high. So the overall error in this, this index score is very low. The effect size is 1.66. So essentially, what that reflects when we are doing a clinical study of kids with dyslexia or kids at risk for dyslexia versus kids that do not have dyslexia, we see that the Dyslexia Index Score is very good at differentiating between those two groups. So the effect size is very strong. The AUC curve is also very strong. We tend to look at AUC numbers at 0.8 and above as being a strong measure. And essentially what that's a reflection of is how well does this test differentiate between two groups. So it's the internal psychometric support. The effect size really is the reflection of its use in practice. So in terms of its use in practice, we know that when we're actually using this to differentiate between groups, it functions very well. And we can see that the first index score is an administration time of just simply 12 minutes. So that's, again, something you're going to have to take into consideration when you are screening, or whether or not, if you're using this in a more diagnostic system, a more diagnostic workflow. Take that into consideration, that when you're administering the subtest for the Dyslexia Index Scores, that will take you 12 minutes. And of course, you're going to have the child in front of you to assess. The second index score for the WIAT-III, again, this is going to be grades 2 through 12 plus. We're looking at, again, the oral reading fluency, pseudo-word decoding, and spelling subtests. We see a mean reliability of 0.98, which again is very high, an effect size of 1.84, and an AUC number of 0.90. So again, those are even higher, an administration time of 15 minutes. So what I want you to start thinking is that if we are to use something like the WIAT-III in an evaluation or in the process of evaluation, whether or not it be at the screening or at the diagnostic classification levels, the psychometric support is there for us. And this next slide shows us a little bit more detail with regard to the sensitivity and specificity. So again, when we think about sensitivity and specificity, we are looking at the rates of true to false positives and true to false negatives. So essentially, we want to take an assessment that has as little or identifies as few false positives and false negatives as possible. We know that that's impossible. Getting close to 1 is our goal. Sensitivity and specificity numbers and we can see here at 0.78 is the lowest for the Dyslexia Index Score 2 for the WIAT-III. They're still very much in the acceptable range. In terms of what else we get from this process is we do get a risk scale. So when you compute the Dyslexia Index Score, you get a risk scale that tells you whether or not a child is at risk or at low risk. And essentially that's a cutoff. It's a criterion score. We're setting the cutoff of 90 standard score. So 90 and above is considered low risk for dyslexia, and 89 and below is considered at risk for dyslexia. So there's two categories in that range. We have a low risk student being between 90 and 97, and very low risk being 98 and above. So essentially, if you're giving the dyslexia index subtests and you get a score of 98, we're considering that student to be very low risk for dyslexia. However, if you have a child that comes up with a standard score of 85, we would consider that child to be at risk. So essentially, in that situation, you have to think about your workflow. What would the workflow be at that point? And I would suggest that if you're giving just these as a screening measure, that would indicate to you you'd need additional data beyond that to do a more comprehensive evaluation and either rule out or rule in dyslexia. Here's an example of what it looks like. This is a computation form that you can see and you will get in the manual. It's the WIAT-III dyslexia computation form. And on the right-hand side, you can see in the yellow box I have here are indications of that risk level. So as I mentioned before, we have 89 and below being considered as an elevated risk. And you can see all the way down to if a child gets below 70, their risk would be very high. So as we move further and further down on the standard score bell curve, we would consider those kids to be more at risk for dyslexia. In terms of why you use the index score, essentially what it's doing is we're able to use this for screening. What I'll What I'll tell you also, though, is that you can use this as part of the targeted screening approach. And the reason for that, or as actually a precursor to more comprehensive assessment. And the reason for that is because it's part of a larger battery, right? So the larger battery that we're looking at would be the full academic achievement and cognitive assessments that we would do in a school setting. But what it's doing, though, is it's also short enough for us to use for screening. So if we're using it in a screening approach or using it for screening, it will help us identify individuals with weaknesses in basic reading, fluency, and spelling. And the question comes up, and I want to make sure that we all hear this pretty clearly. Can the Dyslexia Index Score diagnose dyslexia? Whenever we're thinking about a pure screener, we have to be very careful about how we use it and what we use that screening measure for. So as is the case with any comprehensive assessment, a single score should not be used to diagnose or to classify any disorder. As is the case here with the Dyslexia Index Scores. It's not sufficient to diagnose dyslexia, but it can absolutely contribute to your diagnosis along with other sources of information, like how a child's performing in class, family history, risk factors, and then as we go forward in the more comprehensive evaluation, what those additional scores would look like. Now let me just review very quickly the same information or similar information for the KT3. The KT3, again, has two composite scores, or two dyslexia index scores based on grade. So K and 1 would be giving the phonological processing, letter and word recognition, and letter naming facility subtests. Dyslexia Index Score 2, or grades 2 and above, would be the nonsense word decoding task, the spelling task, and the word recognition fluency task. And as you can see here, we see very similar numbers with regard to reliability of both of those, as well as the effect size and the AUC numbers. You can see that, that it is beyond chance that this test is able to distinguish between two groups, which is essentially what the AUC number provides us with. As a quick reference, a 0.5 AUC would be random chance, like if I was flipping a coin. It's not a very accurate way to think about things. So if I flip a coin, will it be a child with dyslexia or at risk for dyslexia or not? So essentially, the closer we get to 1, the better. So with a 1.0 AUC, it would be yes, every single time we are able to tell what category they are in. We tended to see AUCs most commonly used in medical settings, but it's very helpful and applicable in the screening world because it does help us determine whether or not those screening results can help us categorize or put into basically groups. So in this situation, we're looking at kids that are at risk or not at risk. Again, the effect size is its function in a clinical study. So with an AUC of 0.9 for dyslexia index number 1 on KT3, its effect size was 1.79. So essentially what this is telling us is that that was a very effective measure to differentiate between the clinical and non-clinical samples in the study. And the same is true, you can see on the next row here for dyslexia index 2 for KT3. I'm going to ask those same questions I asked for the WIAT-III, which is why would you use it and can it be used to diagnose dyslexia? So as you can see, it's a very similar answer, right? We're looking at very similar answers for both of those, and the reason is should be pretty apparent. It's that dyslexia index scores will help you identify kids with weaknesses, and you should not use it as a single point to diagnose. And that's the case with every screening measure. Is absolutely the case here, though, because I think sometimes in professional practice, we get into the habit of using tests as standardized measures and say that they will help drive diagnosis or help drive educational classification. But what happens is we have to make sure we step back and say that additional data points are necessary for these. So that's really the what's. That's what it is. It's very basic. Those are the subtests we're looking at. That's what we're using them for. Now let's talk about the whys. Like, why are these important to you? First of all, why were they developed, and why would you start to use them in practice? And to do that, I'm going to first start by just showing you a few examples of state legislation. And I think this is the first part. I don't want to say it's the first place we should start, but I think it does give us a grounding. If we look at several different variations of state legislation, what we see here is that, we see Maine, we see what's going on in Louisiana with regard to universal screening and screening for kids with impairments like dyslexia, and also California, where we see that dyslexia is actually included in their definition of specific learning disability. What that does for us is it requires us to kind of step back and say, how are we going to incorporate this, or how are we going to address this in our current system? Across the country, a vast majority of states have enacted some type of legislation that requires universal screening and screening specifically for dyslexia. So in many states, it's already been accomplished. How are we actually going to fit this into our diagnostic process? But one of the questions that continues to come up is how do we identify it? What do we do here? Do we say dyslexia, or do we say specific learning disability in reading? And essentially what I want you to do is go back to some of our previous discussions. If you've been on my sessions before, you've heard me discuss the neurobiological basis of dyslexia. And it has been historically conditioned, or we're conditioned to think of it as a medically diagnosed condition. Well, that's true historically, but if we think about the neurobiological condition, learning disorders in general are neurobiological in origin. And what happens in our diagnostic process, or our classification process for SLD, is we identify some condition, and then we determine its educational impact. And we then can say that the child qualifies for services with a specific learning disability. Dyslexia is very similar in that fashion, or should be very similar in that fashion, where you are identifying the neurobiological condition, and then you're identifying its impact on the child's reading. Historically, again, like I said, it's been a medically diagnosed condition and can qualify a child for 504 services, but it can also then be identified as a learning disability in reading if you can also then diagnose or identify that impact in performance. And additionally, the whys, it's because it's important for us to identify this as early as possible. Every bit of research that you see, and I would be challenged to find a piece of research that did not show a very similar outcome, is that the earlier we identify and the earlier we intervene on children with dyslexia, the better. Because what we find is that dyslexia gaps occur as young as first grade, and they continue to persist all the way through the grade levels. So you can see in this chart here, which is a reproduction of Dr. Sally Shaywitz's work in 2015, you can see that the achievement gap between kids with typical reading and those with dyslexia occurs in first grade and persists all the way there through ninth grade on this slide. So we know that that's the case. So the why is, of course, we need to figure out how to identify these children earlier. And if we go back on the psychometrics that I talked about earlier, the psychometrics are strong enough that we can feel that our outcomes, our conclusions are going to be sound. And additionally, if we think about that moving into the diagnostic process, it's that we have to evaluate several key components. And again, thinking about that psychometric versus theoretical support, testing for reading versus testing for dyslexia. So it's important that we realize the subtests that are included in both of these dyslexia index scores are reading tests. They're tests for specifically reading. How does this fit into dyslexia then? Well, essentially, what that takes is it takes the clinical studies. It takes us to be able to say, let's apply those subtests in such a way that helps us differentiate between kids with and without dyslexia. So what I want to caution you against is that many times we take tests of reading as screeners, and that's okay because we need to determine whether or not those tests, whether or not children are having difficulties with specific skills. So those tests determine that for us. But they don't necessarily indicate dyslexia until we apply our evaluation lens or our clinical lenses here. What the Dyslexia Index Scores do is they say we are able to look specifically at dyslexia because we were able to run clinical studies on it and determine whether or not they differentiated well or did not differentiate well. And as you saw before, in our clinical studies, they do differentiate very, very well. And essentially you're trying to answer the question of how do you predict something. And we're looking at the idea of incremental variance. So the whole picture there is dyslexia, and we're trying to determine or trying to gather more and more information as we go along in the evaluation process to get closer to that prediction model. So essentially what we're looking at is varied levels of data that get us closer to that larger picture. So existing variance might be something like family history. New variance might be something like a child is performing poorly in reading tasks in the classroom. New variance, the blue variance, may be something like the Dyslexia Index Scores. Additional beyond that could be diagnostic assessments. So we're trying to get closer and closer to that prediction model so that we make effective and correct decisions, right? Because the outcome is super important. The risk there is important. We could be making or breaking depending on when we get these kids identified. Now let's talk about the how. So exactly what does that mean? What do we have to do to get these scores to function? And the how starts with the foundational research, which is the Essentials book. So in 2016, Christina Breaux and Elizabeth Lichtenberger wrote the Essentials of KTEA-3 and WIAT-III assessment, and that is published by Wiley. And that's where they started this research. So you can actually go and read that book, and it will show you information about how the Dyslexia Index Scores were determined and why they were chosen. You can look at the models that were chosen and the models that showed us the best ability to differentiate. Let's look in a little bit more detail, though, about the how do you do it of WIAT-III. The first thing I'll start with are the materials that you need. So if you currently own a WIAT-III, you really don't need much more other than the dyslexia-specific manual. So for K through 1, you'll need the examiner's manual, you need the technical manual, you'll need the enhanced record form or a record form there, and you'll also need the pencil without an eraser for the spelling subtest. For grades 2 through 12 plus, you'll need all those first things. You also need the pseudo-word decoding card, the audio files that are on CD for the pseudo-word decoding test, oral reading fluency, stopwatch, response booklet, also any recording device, and then also a pencil without an eraser. So what you see there is that essentially you'll not need much beyond your current toolkit. When you purchase the WIAT-III, or if you have it in your case there, you'll just need access to the manual so that you can compute the scores. And what I like about this is coming from the manual as well, is we also give some suggestions or some ideas about steps. So the steps that you use, or the steps that you take to compute it, first of all, you'll give the subtest that should be understood as step number 1. As step number pre-1 is administer the subtest that you need based on the grade, and then you'll transfer those subtest scores. You'll compute the Dyslexia Index Scores in the percentile rank based on the charts that are in the manual. What you'll then do is identify the risk classification. So based on the categories that I mentioned earlier, and you can see them here on this as well, where you see that standard scores below 90 or 90 and above are considered low risk, and then you can see where it says that 80 to 85 are elevated risk, 77 to 84 are moderate risk, 70 to 76 are high risk, or 70 and below are very high risk. So at that point, you'll identify their risk classification. You'll then complete the suggested interpretive statement, and if I scroll back, I can show you that real quick. I apologize. So if we go back to this, we can see that even on the record form, we have down here at the bottom suggested interpretive statements. So again, you can use those if you'd like, or come up with something that fits your system well. And then that's it. You then figure out where to place that in your evaluation process. So essentially what you're doing here is you're giving it, you're computing it, you're identifying the risk classification, and then you are making an interpretive statement, like what should we do with that child. So in this situation, we would say something like, I can show you this one here that's in the middle of the page. The examinees, or John Doe's Dyslexia Index Score indicates his risk for dyslexia is in the elevated to low range. These results on their own are not sufficient to identify or diagnose dyslexia. A comprehensive evaluation is recommended. So from that point, it's important you realize or you determine what your next steps are going to be. because that's really the important part. What do you do with this finding? Where should you go from there? So the how do you do of KTEA-III, let's look at that real quickly. So here are the test materials. Again, if you have the KTEA-III in your toolkit, you don't need a whole lot more other than the manual. You can see what's included here, which you'll need for the K through 1 kids and the 2 through 12 plus kids. Very similar across both of them, and those are the things that you'll need to compute it and to administer it. In terms of the steps, basically very similar to what I mentioned before. It's the same thing. Pre-step 1 would be, again, to administer the correct subtest based on the examinee's grade or age. Step 1 would be to transfer the subtest scores and then compute the index scores and percentile ranks. Step 3, again, very consistent, is to compute a confidence interval if you need to, optionally. Identify a risk classification. And you can see that the risk classification is the same. So if we look at it here, we can see that standard scores of 90 and above are considered low risk. Low risk has between 90 and 97 is very low risk. 98 and above are considered very low risk there. So low risk and very low risk. Standard scores below 90 are considered at risk, with scores between 85 and 89 being elevated, 87 to 84 being moderate, 70 to 76 being high risk, and 70 and below being very high risk. Okay, so those classifications are the same as we saw for the WIAT-III. And then if we look here, it's again, complete the suggested interpretive statement. So it's a very similar process depending on which test you use. It's very similar, so it should look very, very similar to both of you, for both of you, the users here. If I'm looking at something like pricing, this is exactly what you would have to add. So the Dyslexia Index Scores manual, the paper version, is $28. The digital version on Q Global is $28. You can see a pattern here. The WIAT-III paper manual is $28, and as is the Q Global manual. What's important to remember, though, is if you are a customer who wants to purchase one or the other, if you purchase the paper version, you don't get digital. You don't get access to one or the other. You have to purchase them separately. So if you are a Q Global user, you can purchase it digitally and have access to it there. Currently, today, October 12th of 2018, you must compute them by hand. That may change in the very near future, but currently you have to compute those by hand. Okay, so that's exactly how you do it. Again, that was a very quick half an hour, right, folks? Essentially, I wanted to walk it through with you, what it is, how you do it, why we did it, and why it's important to you. I do have a couple minutes that I'll just walk through some of the Q&As that I have here at the end. We have some information up here if you're interested for our colleagues in the U.S. or in Canada. You can find some more information on your websites, or feel free to send me an email if you have a specific question that I didn't get to answer. So let me spend the next couple of minutes just answering a few of the questions that I have here in Q&A, and you can find some more answers on our website if you wish to go there as well. So just very quickly, can the WIAT-III Dyslexia Index Scores be group administered? So except for the spelling subtest, which could be administered in a small group format, although not always the best option, but can be done that way, the Dyslexia Index Scores have to be individually administered. And I think you're going to notice that as a theme between both tests. What if the Dyslexia Index results suggest that further testing is necessary? So you could administer at that point the comprehensive form. It's the next logical step that we think about. All the standard scores from the Dyslexia Index subtest can be applied to a more extensive assessment. So in that situation, if you give the Dyslexia Index Scores, you don't need to re-administer them. You just basically you would then use them in the comprehensive form if you felt like you had to get more information. This is a good one here. Should I use age-based or grade-based norms? So basically the types of norms that you'd use for the subtests must also be used for the Dyslexia Index Scores. So for example, if Dyslexia Index subtest standard scores were derived using grade-based norms, then grade-based norms must also be used to compute the Dyslexia Index standard score. Once the students have graduated high school, only the age-based norms are provided. Okay, let me go through one more slide and then we'll end, and then you guys can look at the handouts that were sent out to you via email and kind of look through these at your leisure as well. Are out of grade level or out of level norms provided? No, they're not. Grade-based norms must be used to obtain scores when an examinee's age is out of level, either young or old for their age. And again, I already answered this one, which is, do you have to re-administer those same subtests from the WIAT-III Dyslexia Index if you want to follow up with a more comprehensive evaluation? And the easy answer there is no. So I hope you all enjoyed our quick half an hour today. Hopefully you had your answers to your questions, and you have a good resource for going forward with the WIAT-III or KTEA-III Dyslexia Index Scores. Again, feel free to go to our website if you have any additional questions, and have an awesome rest of your day.